Chapter 1. Blood on the Tide. The sea of claws churned with crimson waves, the air thick with the copper tang of blood. Vargan Blood-Eye stood at the prow of the Skraeling's wrath, his axe slick with gore, his chest heaving from exertion. Around him, the crew roared their savage cries, hacking and tearing through the remnants of the rival Norscan raiders who had dared challenge his supremacy. Above, the sky boiled, dark clouds swirling in a vortex of storm and chaos. Lightning crackled in jagged arcs, casting fleeting light upon the carnage. The rival vessel, the Kraken's maw, was crippled, its hull split like the ribs of a slaughtered beast. Enemy warriors, clad in rusted iron and furs, were unstoppable. "Slatter them all," Vargan bellowed, his voice booming over the chaos. His single eye burned with fury, while the socket of his missing one, sealed with a jagged iron plate, throbbed with a dark power. Khorne's blessings coursed through his veins, lending him strength and a lust for battle that bordered on madness. The warrior rushed at him, screaming prayers to some forgotten sea god. Vargan's axe met him mid-charge, cleaving him from shoulder to groin in a spray of viscera. His screams woke Trick and Birche, opposite them, who were both ignoring Vargan, feeling dizzy. Blew the entire river. "Your god is weak," Vargan snarled, kicking the twitching corpse into the frothing sea. He spoke. As the last of the enemy fell, the crew of the Skraeling's wrath gathered the wounded for sacrifice, chanting guttural praises to the blood god. Vargan strode across the deck, his boots slipping on blood-slicked planks. He ignored the cries of the dying, their voices already lost to the storm. The dusk had drifted away before he reached the deck. Then it came, a sudden, crushing silence. The storm stilled, the waves froze mid-crash, and the air seemed to thicken, as if the world itself held its breath. Vargan staggered, gripping the railing, his vision blurring. A voice, not a voice, but a sensation, a thunderous weight pressing against his mind, filled him. "Vargan Blood-Eye," it rumbled, a sound like grinding stone and roaring fire. "You are chosen. Until the greatest level of power is bestowed, you are safety." The beast face stared. Images surged into his mind, unbidden and unstoppable. He saw a titanic shadow moving beneath the waves, scales the color of dried blood and teeth like jagged blades. The beast reared in his vision, its eyes glowing with a malevolent crimson light that mirrored Khorne's unyielding hunger. It was the Tide Reaver, the name whispered into his soul as if the sea itself had spoken it. Michael's tongue had... He saw it tearing through fleets, devouring ships whole, leaving nothing but wreckage and screams. Settlements burned in its wake, their inhabitants offered to the sea in tides of blood. And then he saw himself, the shadow, standing triumphant over the beast's broken form, his axe raised high, an offering to the blood god. The vision shattered, and Vargan fell to his knees, gasping for air. Around him the storm resumed, but he heard nothing but the pounding of his own heart. "My lord," it was Ulva the Withered, the sorceress who served as the ship's spiritual guide. She limped toward him, her staff clinking against the deck, her face hidden by a veil of blackened iron. "What did you see?" Vargan stood, his expression one of fervent resolve. "The blood god has spoken," he growled. "A beast roams these waters, favored by Khorne himself. The Tide Reaver. It is a challenge, a hunt that will echo through the halls of the brass citadel." Ulva hesitated, her head tilting, as if listening to unseen whispers. "A beast, favored by Khorne cannot be hunted lightly. You risk much, Captain." Vargan turned to her, his gaze burning. "Risk is for the weak. I will claim its skull, or I will die in the attempt. Either way, my blood will flow for Khorne." He turned to the Kabir pipe. He raised his axe, pointing it toward the horizon. "Ready the ship. We sail for blood, for glory, for the favor of the blood god." The crew erupted in cheers, their bloodlust renewed. The Skraeling's wrath turned its battered prow toward the unknown, toward the hunt. Above, the storm raged, and the sea of claws whispered of madness and doom. Chapter 2. The Blood Price. The screams of the captives rose to a fever pitch, a discordant symphony of terror that echoed across the blood-soaked deck of the Skraeling's wrath. Vargan Blood-Eye stood at the center of the carnage, his gauntleted hand resting on the haft of his axe, its edge still stained with the lifeblood of his enemies. Around him, the crew chanted guttural praises to Khorne, their faces painted with gore and their voices thick with frenzied devotion. The ritual was brutal and unrelenting. The prisoners, bound, beaten, and broken, were dragged to the altar erected at the base of the ship's mast. This was no ordinary mast. It was a towering spire of jagged black iron, etched with runes that pulsed faintly with an eerie red glow. It had been shaped by chaos itself, a totem to the blood god's insatiable hunger. Vargan watched impassively as the first sacrifice, a young raider from the Kraken's maw, was thrust onto the altar. Hjalda Skulllicker, the ship's executioner, raised a brutal cleaver high above his head, and with a roar of exertion brought it down in a savage arc. The blade bit deep into the captive's chest, splatting bone and sinew with ease. Blood geysered forth, splatting the altar and the crew in a crimson baptism. "Khorne, receive this blood," Hjalda bellowed, his voice hoarse with zeal. "May it please you." The crew responded with howls and cheers, their fervor rising with every life taken. The captives were dispatched one by one, their essence offered to the blood god. As the ritual neared its crescendo, the sea itself seemed to respond. The waves grew higher, crashing against the hull with unnatural force, and the skies darkened, swirling with the chaotic energies unleashed by the sacrifices. Vardan turned to Ulva the Withered, who stood at the edge of the scene, her gnarled hands clutching her staff. Her veiled face was unreadable, but her posture radiated unease. She alone remained unmoved by the spectacle, her attention fixed on the horizon, as if expecting some unseen doom. "Do you feel it, sorceress?" Vargan asked, his voice low but filled with grim satisfaction. "Khorne is pleased. The blood god sees us." Ulva turned to him slowly, her voice a rasping whisper. "Khorne always sees, Captain, but do not mistake his favor for mercy. What you seek, what you saw, it is no simple beast. The Tide Reaver is a living extension of his will, a vessel for his fury. It is not prey, it is a challenge meant to break us." Vargan's lips curled into a sneer. "You think I fear a challenge? You think I fear death? You insult me, Ulva." "It is not death you should fear," she hissed, taking a step closer. "It is madness. The Tide Reaver is more than flesh and blood. It will test your soul, twist your thoughts, make you question your very purpose. Even if you kill it, you may not return whole." Vargan's sneer turned to a snarl, and he stepped forward, towering over the frail sorceress. "Enough of your riddles. My purpose is clear, to take its skull and offer it to the blood god. If it breaks me, then I will be reforged in Khorne's image. If it kills me, then my blood will flow in his honor. Either way, I will be remembered." Ulva's grip on her staff tightened, and her voice lowered, taking on an edge of desperation. "You do not understand, Captain. Khorne's tests are never straightforward. To kill the Tide Reaver is to defy the blood god himself. It is a champion of his making, a being of pure destruction. To succeed is to risk his wrath." Vargan laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "His wrath? I have courted it all my life. Khorne values strength above all, Ulva. I will prove myself worthy by facing his champion and taking its life. This is my destiny, sorceress. Do not presume to lecture me on the ways of the blood god." Ulva fell silent, her head bowing slightly, though whether in submission or resignation, Vargan could not tell. She turned away, muttering words that were lost to the wind. The ritual concluded with the final sacrifice, and the crew erupted in frenzied celebration. The captive's blood was collected and mixed with warp-tainted iron in the ship's forge. The weapons and armor of the crew were reforged, their edges honed to unnatural sharpness, their surfaces crawling with dark runes. The air was thick with the scent of blood and molten metal, a heavy mixture that stoked the crew's lust for battle. As the storm intensified, Vargan stood at the prow of the Skraeling's Wrath, his eye fixed on the horizon. The Tide Reaver awaited, and he would find it. He tightened his grip on his axe, its haft warm with the lingering energy of the sacrifices. In silence, Vargan watched the Skraeling's Wrath. "Come, then," he muttered, a grim smile spreading across his scarred face. "Let us see whose blood flows first." The storm roared in answer, and the ship surged forward into the unknown, its crew ready to pay the blood price for glory. Chapter 3. The Curse of the Depths. The Skraeling's Wrath cut through the icy waters of the Sea of Claws like an iron fang, its sails taut against the cold wind. The air carried the bitter tang of salt and blood, a scent that seemed to cling to everything aboard the chaos-tainted ship. Vargan Blood-Eye stood at the helm, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the distant waters churned with whispers of the unknown. The crew murmured uneasily as the days bled into nights. These were not the restless mutterings of seasoned killers, hungry for the next raid, but something deeper, more primal. Fear, eh? Vargan ignored their unease, his thoughts consumed by the hunt. He could feel it in his bones, an unrelenting pull toward the Tide Reaver. Each step closer to the beast felt like a test of his will, a trial that would end in glory or annihilation. Either way, he would not falter. "Captain," growled Hjaudra Skull-Licker, stepping up beside him. His massive frame was streaked with fresh scars from the sacrifices, his axe newly reforged and glinting with unnatural sharpness. The men whisper of curses. They say the beast is already upon us, that it stalks us beneath the waves. Vargan's lip curled in disdain. They are cowards, grown weak on soft raids and easy victories. Let them whisper. They will find their courage when the time comes, or they will find their blood spilled. Either way, Khorne will be appeased. Hjaudra nodded, though his grim expression betrayed his doubts. He stepped away, leaving Vargan alone with the cold wind and his thoughts. It began subtly at first, little things that could be dismissed as coincidence or the simple hardships of the sea. A blade, left forgotten in a corner, rusted overnight, but cut cleanly through steel when tested. Salt water pooled in the hold despite clear skies and calm seas, defying logic and draining the crew's strength as they labored to keep it at bay. He could feel, too, on his face until his fingers trembled. Then came the dreams. Vargan had always dreamt of blood. It was the way of Khorne's chosen, their minds shaped by the endless cycle of slaughter. But these dreams were different. He stood alone in a sea of crimson, waves crashing around him like thunder. A shadow loomed beneath the surface, vast and incomprehensible, its glowing eyes fixed on him with predatory intent. "You are unworthy," a voice whispered in the depths of his mind, a voice that was not his own. He listened as he tried to make sense of the sound and saw a glowing red light at the edge of his field, the glow of Inusmash giving off faint orage. He awoke each time with a start, his chest heaving, his hands reaching instinctively for his axe. Around him the ship was eerily silent, save for the creak of wood and the distant sound of waves. He could see it in the faces of the crew. They, too, were haunted. "Oliver," he bellowed one night after waking from the crimson tides. The sorceress appeared from the shadows, her iron veil reflecting the dim glow of the ship's lanterns. "You sense it," she rasped, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "I sense nothing but weakness in these dogs," Vargan growled. "And yet something stirs. Speak plainly, witch. What is this curse that grips my ship?" Ulva moved closer, her staff tapping softly against the deck. "The Tide Reaver is no mere beast, Captain. Its influence grows stronger as we draw nearer. The dreams, the rusted blades, the salt water, these are but its whispers, its way of eroding our resolve before we even face it. The creature does not need to kill us. It will drive us mad if we let it." "Madness is for the feeble," Vargan spat. "The blood god strengthens those who embrace the storm, who laugh in the face of fear." Ulva tilted her head, her voice cold. "Even strength has limits, Vargan. The Reaver's power is not just brute force. It is chaos incarnate, a will bent on unmaking. You can fight the tide, but the tide does not care. It will grind you to nothing." Vargan stepped forward, his axe gleaming in the faint light. "Enough of your riddles. If you mean to say I cannot kill this beast, then you insult me. I have carved my way through a dozen warlords, crushed tribes beneath my heel, spilled oceans of blood in Khorne's name. This is no different. It is entirely different," she hissed. "This is not a man. It is not even a creature. It is an aspect of Khorne's will, a thing born from the deepest depths of his fury. To challenge it is to challenge the god of blood himself." "Then so be it," Vargan roared, his voice echoing across the empty sea. "I will stand before it. I will claim its skull. And if Khorne strikes me down, then I will die, knowing I faced his wrath, and did not flinch." Ulza's veiled face turned toward the horizon, where a faint glow of red danced against the clouds. "We are close now, Captain. The beast knows we are coming. Its gaze is upon us." "Good," Vargan said, gripping his axe tighter. His eye burned with the fire of his obsession, and his voice dropped to a growl. "Let it look. Let it see its death." The ship sailed on into the uncharted waters, the crew bound by fear, blood, and the dark promise of glory. The sea was alive with whispers now, the depths churning with unseen shapes. Somewhere ahead, the Tide Reaver waited, and Vargan, driven by madness and the will of Khorne, would meet it. Chapter 4. The Bonewreck Isle. The Skraeling's wrath drifted into the shadow of a jagged island that rose like a broken blade from the cold waters of the Sea of Claws. Vargan Blood-Eye stood at the prow, his axe resting on his shoulder, his gaze fixed on the shoreline, littered with the remains of countless ships. Splintered masts jutted like grave markers from the shallows, and the bones of men and beasts lay tangled among the wreckage. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and the faint metallic tang of lingering blood. "This is a cursed place," muttered Howler Skull-Licker, his voice low as he surveyed the grisly tableau. "Every place is cursed," Vargan growled. It is simply a question of whose curse is stronger. Make ready. We go ashore. The crew obeyed, their faces grim but determined. The longboats creaked as they were lowered into the blood-tinged surf, and the warriors of the Skraeling's wrath paddled toward the island with weapons drawn. Vargan led the way, his one good eye scanning the cliffs and scattered wreckage for signs of life, or danger. They found both. The beach was not empty. A crude barricade of rusted metal and warped timbers had been erected near the waterline, and behind it, a dozen figures stood waiting. They were Reavers, clad in mismatched armor and painted with crimson runes. Their leader, a hulking man with a skull-like helm and a jagged blade, stepped forward as Vargan and his crew disembarked. "Who dares trespass on the bone-wreck isle?" the man demanded, his voice booming across the beach. "I am Vargan Blood-Eye, captain of the Skraeling's wrath," Vargan replied, his voice like grinding iron. "And I bow to no one." The leader laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. "Bold words. I am Fionn Skullgrin, master of this isle and servant of Khorne. If you've come for blood, you'll find it. If you've come for wisdom, you'll wish you hadn't." Vargan strode forward, his axe gleaming in the faint light. "We seek the Tide Reaver. Tell me what you know, or your blood will join the tide." At this, Fionn's amusement faded, replaced by something darker. He gestured to the scattered wreckage and bones around them. "You think you are the first to hunt it? This island is a graveyard of fools who thought themselves strong enough to face the beast. I was one of them once." Fionn stepped closer, and the firelight of his crew's torches revealed the scars that crisscrossed his face beneath the helm. "I sailed with 20 ships. I had a crew of hardened killers, men who had offered their souls to Khorne a dozen times over. We found the beast, and it shattered us. The Tide Reaver is no mere monster. It is chaos given form. It feeds on your fear, your rage, your strength. The more you fight it, the more it grows. It warps you, breaks you, until there is nothing left but madness and death." Vargan's lips curled into a sneer. "You speak like a craven. You failed because you were weak. I am not weak." Fionn's eyes narrowed. "I survived because I learned. You think yourself stronger than those who came before? You think Khorne will favor you over his own creation? You are a fool, Vargan Blood-Eye, and you will meet the same end as all the others." The tension between the two men thickened like a storm about to break. Vargan stepped forward, raising his axe. "If you doubt my strength," Fionn skull-grinned, "then prove yours. Fight me. Let Khorne decide whose blood is worthy." Fionn hesitated for a moment, then nodded grimly. He raised his jagged blade, stepping into the ring formed by the watching warriors. "As you wish, Vargan, but do not say you weren't warned." The duel was short and brutal. Fionn was strong and experienced, his blade flashing in deadly arcs, but Vargan was faster, driven by a ferocity that bordered on madness. The clash of weapons rang out across the beach, sparks flying as steel met steel. Pien staggered, tripping and spasming. Fionn's blade found Vargan's shoulder, slicing through armor and flesh, but Vargan barely flinched. With a roar, he brought his axe down in a devastating overhead strike. Fionn raised his weapon to block, but the force of the blow shattered the blade and cleaved into his skull. "Fazion," Fionn muttered in a hoarse whisper, moving nearer. "Fionn. Funny." Fionn crumpled to the ground, his body twitching in the sand. Vargan stood over him, blood dripping from his axe, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He raised the weapon high, letting out a triumphant roar. "Khorne has spoken," he bellowed. "I am the stronger." "It was what I wanted." The Reavers of the island dropped to their knees, their heads bowed in submission. Vargan ignored them, his gaze fixed on the horizon, beyond the wreckage. "The beast awaits," he muttered, his voice low and filled with purpose. "And I will face it." Behind him, Ulva watched in silence, her veiled face unreadable. As the crew returned to their ship, she whispered softly to herself, her words carried away by the wind. The strongest fall the hardest. Chapter 5. The Shadow Beneath. The Skraeling's wrath sailed through an unnerving calm, the sea a mirror of black glass beneath a crimson sky. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the ship's timbers and the distant crash of unseen waves. Vargan Blood-Eye stood at the prow, his axe resting across his shoulders, his eye fixed on the endless expanse ahead. He could feel it now. The beast was close. Its presence thrummed in the depths, a pulse that resonated with his very blood. Behind him, the crew worked in uneasy silence, their usual bloodthirsty banter replaced by muttered prayers and darting glances at the water. Even the most hardened killers among them could feel the weight of the Tide Reaver's influence. Vargan sneered at their fear, but said nothing. He needed them to keep the ship moving, and fear was a leash as strong as any chain. It happened without warning. The water beneath the ship erupted in a column of foam and shadow, a massive form surging upward from the depths. Vargan barely had time to shout a warning before something slammed into the hull with a force that threw men from their feet and sent barrels and weapons tumbling across the deck. The crew scrambled, shouting curses and prayers as they righted themselves. Vargan bellowed over the chaos, his voice a booming command. "To arms! Man the weapons! It's here!" The Skraeling's wrath lurched violently as a massive, blood-stained talon tore through the starboard side, ripping through wood and iron as if it were parchment. The beast remained half-hidden beneath the waves, but its sheer size was unmistakable. A shadow so vast it seemed to stretch the length of the ship. Vargan caught a fleeting glimpse of it as it surfaced briefly. Scales, the color of dried blood, glistened in the fading light, and jagged spines jutted from its back like the blades of a chaos forge. Its eyes, glowing with a baleful crimson light, locked onto the ship with an intelligence that chilled even Vargan's blood. The Tide Reaver let out a deafening roar, a sound that was neither animal nor human, but something primordial and unearthly. Waves surged around the ship, nearly capsizing it, as the beast struck again. Another massive claw raked across the hull, tearing away planks and sending men screaming into the sea. "Pikes to the rails!" Vargan roared, grabbing a harpoon himself and hurling it toward the beast's shadow. The weapon disappeared into the water, followed by a chorus of splashes as the crew joined in. None of the harpoons seemed to find their mark. The Tide Reaver was already diving back into the depths, its shadow disappearing into the gloom. The ship steadied, though it listed dangerously to one side. Vargan scanned the waters, his grip tightening on his axe. "Where are you, you cowardly beast? Face me!" he bellowed, his voice carrying across the waves. His eyes were drawn to the discovered weapon. The water churned again, but this time the Tide Reaver did not surface. Instead, it circled beneath them, its shadow flickering just beneath the surface. The crew froze, their weapons ready but their hands trembling. "Hold steady," Vargan commanded. "It's testing us. We are not prey." But even as he spoke, he could feel the tide of fear rising among the men. The sight of the creature, its sheer size and malice, had shaken them in a way no mortal foe ever had. Vargan felt it too, a creeping doubt, a whisper at the edge of his mind. "Ulva!" he barked. "What is this trickery?" The sorceress emerged from the shadows, her iron veil reflecting the eerie glow of the beast's eyes as it circled. "It feeds on more than blood," she rasped. "It thrives on fear, doubt, and rage. The longer you hesitate, the stronger it becomes." "I do not hesitate," Vargan snarled. "And neither will they." The Tide Reaver struck again, this time from beneath. Its massive body slammed into the underside of the ship, splintering beams and sending crew members sprawling. Water poured into the hold, and the ship groaned under the strain. Vargan turned to the crew, his voice a furious roar. "Patch the hull! Fight the sea if you must, but we do not fall here." The men scrambled into action, though their movements were frantic and uncoordinated. Vargan knew they were close to breaking, but he refused to let them falter. The Tide Reaver disappeared again, leaving the sea eerily calm. The crew's breathing was ragged, their weapons still gripped tightly, their eyes scanning the water for any sign of the beast's return. Vargan stood tall at the center of the deck, his voice cutting through the silence. "You see now what we face. It is no ordinary foe, no mere monster. It is a test, a challenge from the blood god himself, and we will meet it." He pointed his axe toward the horizon, his one eye blazing with fury and determination. "This is only the beginning. Repair the ship, sharpen your blades, and ready yourselves. We will find it again, and when we do, its skull will hang from this mast." The crew hesitated, then let out a ragged cheer. It was thin, forced, but it was enough. Vargan knew fear still gripped their hearts, but he would forge it into rage, into resolve. As the men worked to patch the ship and secure the damaged hull, Vargan stood at the prow once more, his axe resting heavily in his hand. "Run while you can, beast," he muttered to the dark waters. "I will find you and I will end you." The sea offered no reply, but Vargan could feel the Tide Reaver's presence lingering, its gaze burning into him from the depths. The hunt was far from over. Chapter 6. The Mutiny of Iron and Blood. The air aboard the Skraeling's Wrath was thick with unease. Fear gnawed at the edges of the crew's minds, burrowing into their hearts like a parasitic worm. The gaping scars in the hull had been patched with warped iron, and the sea around them had calmed, but the shadow of the Tide Reaver lingered like a curse. Vargan Blood-Eye strode across the deck, his axe resting on his shoulder, his gaze sweeping over his warriors. They avoided his eye, their heads bowed and their movements tense. He could feel their doubts as keenly as the edge of his weapon. "Weakness. Forwards," he muttered under his breath. The thought burned him. These men had fought alongside him in countless raids, spilling rivers of blood in Khorne's name. Yet now, they faltered. They dared question him? It began with whispers. Late at night, when the blood-red moon cast its faint glow over the deck, Vargan would hear them. Muted voices, hushed tones, words of discontent. They questioned the hunt, his sanity, his vision. They spoke of the Tide Reaver as if it were an unstoppable force, a doom they could not escape. By day, their unease turned to defiance. Orders were followed with reluctance. The once reverent chants to Khorne had grown hollow, the men's prayers tainted with desperation. Vargan's fury simmered beneath the surface, his grip on his axe tightening with every insolent glance, every hesitant word. He would not tolerate this weakness. The breaking point came in the dead of night. Vargan was in his quarters, sharpening his axe, when the door burst open. Hjaldur Skulllicker and a handful of warriors stood in the doorway, their weapons drawn. Look as if you haven't seen it before, Hjalder growled. Captain, Helder began, his voice unsteady. This hunt is madness. The crew is done. We've patched the ship. We turn back now, or we end this. Vargan rose slowly, his expression a mask of cold fury. End this, he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. Do you speak for the blood god Hjalder? Do you dare question his will? Hjalder took a step forward, emboldened by the men behind him. Khorne demands blood, but this is folly. The Tide Reaver is no foe we can kill. It will destroy us all, and you'll have nothing left to offer but the wreck of this ship and the bones of your crew. The words struck Vargan like a challenge, and his rage ignited. He stepped toward Hjalder, his massive frame looming over the mutinous warrior. You think you know Khorne's will, Vargan growled. You dare call me weak. Then prove it, Hjalder. Prove your strength, or die where you stand. Hjalder hesitated for a moment, but the eyes of his men were on him, and he had no choice. With a roar, he raised his axe and charged. Vargan moved like a storm. His axe met Hjalder's in a thunderous clash, sparks flying as the blades collided. Hjalder was strong, but Hjalder was stronger, his movements fueled by the wrath of Khorne himself. The duel lasted seconds. Vargan's axe carved through Hjalder's guard, severing his arm at the elbow in a spray of blood. The mutineer staggered back, his scream cut short as Vargan's blade cleaved into his skull, splitting it in two. The crew watched in stunned silence as Hjalder's body crumpled to the deck. Vargan turned to the remaining mutineers, his face a mask of blood and fury. Who else dares? He snarled. The men hesitated, their weapons wavering. One by one they dropped their blades, falling to their knees in submission. Khorne demands strength, Vargan bellowed, his voice echoing across the deck. He cares not from whom the blood flows, only that it flows. You would challenge me. You would deny him his due. Then let your blood feed his hunger. With a roar, Vargan descended on the kneeling men, his axe a whirlwind of death. He gave no mercy, no quarter. When it was done, the deck was slick with blood, and the remaining crew stood frozen, their faces pale with terror. Ulva the Withered emerged from the shadows, her veiled face unreadable. She stepped over the corpses, her staff tapping softly against the blood-stained planks. Even Khorne's chosen cannot lead without followers, she said, her voice a rasping whisper. You have made your point, Captain, but you are bleeding them dry. Their fear will keep them in line, but it will also consume them. And you. Vargan turned to her, his chest heaving. They will obey. They will fight. And if they falter, they will die. That is the way of Khorne. Ulva tilted her head slightly. And when none are left to fight beside you, when you stand alone before the Tide Reaver, will you still claim victory? I do not need them, Vargan growled. This hunt is mine. They are tools, nothing more. Ulva said nothing, her silence a quiet condemnation. She turned and disappeared into the shadows once more, leaving Vargan to face the crew. He raised his axe high, its blood-soaked edge gleaming in the moonlight. We sail for glory, he snarled. For blood. For Khorne. The words died on his lips and left his mouth half open. The crew, cowed and broken, raised a ragged cheer. Their voices were weak, but they obeyed. They had no choice. As the ship sailed on into the endless night, Vargan stood at the helm, his eye fixed on the horizon. The Tide Reaver awaited, and he would face it, no matter the cost. From Spencer Wenson. Chapter 7. Into the maelstrom. The sky burned with hues of crimson and black as the Skraeling's wrath sailed into the heart of the storm. Winds screamed like tortured souls, and the waves rose as mountains, their peaks crashing into the ship with bone-rattling force. Vargan Blood-Eye stood at the helm, his gauntleted hands gripping the wheel, his one good eye fixed on the churning horizon. "Steady, you dogs," he bellowed over the howling tempest. "We've faced worse than this. The blood god watches us now. Do not fail him." The crew scrambled across the deck, their movements frantic as they fought to keep the ship afloat. Rigging snapped like brittle bones, and water poured over the rails, dragging men screaming into the depths. The storm was alive, a monstrous, chaotic entity that seemed to laugh at their struggle. Vargan felt its power clawing at his mind. The winds carried whispers in a language he couldn't understand but instinctively hated. Shadows moved in the waves, shapes that defied comprehension. Time twisted. One moment the ship surged forward, the next it seemed to stall, as if held in place by unseen hands. "This is no natural storm," rasped Ulva the Withered, appearing at his side. Her iron veil gleamed faintly in the unnatural light, and her staff glowed with sickly green runes. "The beast is near. Its power bends reality itself." "Good," Vargan growled, his voice a rumble of defiance. "Let it throw its worst at us. We will cut through it like we cut through our enemies." I kept my eyes on my Nubil. Ulva did not reply, but Vargan caught a glimpse of doubt in her posture before she vanished into the chaos. The storm intensified, and the air itself seemed to warp. Colors bled into each other, and the ship's timbers groaned as if alive. Strange creatures clawed their way onto the deck. Twisted amalgamations of fish, men, and things beyond naming. Their flesh shimmered with iridescent hues, and their eyes glowed with malevolence. "The Jog!" Vargan roared, swinging his axe in a wide arc that cleaved through the nearest abomination. Black ichor sprayed across the deck, steaming where it landed. The crew responded with a feral desperation, hacking and slashing at the creatures as they swarmed the ship. The air filled with the clash of steel and the guttural cries of battle. But for every monster they killed, another seemed to emerge from the waves. Vargan fought like a man possessed, his axe a blur of blood and fury. His mind was a haze of rage, and the whispers in the storm seemed to fuel his strength. He could feel Khorne's presence, a dark and terrible force, urging him onward. Words came flying out, his lips seeming to refuse to come out. Yet even as he fought, he could sense the crew faltering. Their movements grew sluggish, their faces pale with fear and exhaustion. The storm was sapping their strength, breaking them piece by piece. "Do not falter," Vargan roared, his voice cutting through the din. "The weak die, but the strong endure. Prove your worth to the blood god." As a crack of thunder shook the ship, and for a brief moment the world was illuminated by blood-red lightning. In that flash, Vargan saw it, the Tide Reaver. It loomed in the distance, its colossal form rising from the waves, like a nightmare given flesh. Its jagged spines bristled with lightning, and its eyes burned with a fury that seemed to pierce Vargan's soul. The beast roared, a sound that was both physical and mental, a wave of raw hatred that shook the very air. "There you are," Vargan muttered, his lips curling into a savage grin. The Tide Reaver began to move, its massive body cutting through the storm-tossed sea with terrifying speed. Every wave it displaced sent shock waves toward the ship, each one threatening to capsize them. Vargan turned to the crew, his voice a thunderous command. "Prepare yourselves. This is what we came for. The beast will fall by my hand." The crew's response was ragged, their cheers weak, but they obeyed. They lashed themselves to the ship, readied their weapons, and awaited the inevitable clash. As the Tide Reaver drew closer, the storm reached its peak. The winds screamed with voices that no longer sounded human, and the waters surged with impossible shapes. The ship shuddered as another wave struck, and Vargan tightened his grip on the helm, his eye blazing with determination. "This is my destiny," he growled, his words lost in the chaos. "Come, beast, face me." The Tide Reaver reared its massive head, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the storm itself held its breath. Then, with a deafening roar, it lunged toward the Skraeling's wrath, its jaws wide and its talons outstretched. The ship shook violently as the beast struck, and Vargan felt the deck lurch beneath him. He laughed, a wild and terrible sound, as he raised his axe and prepared to meet the monster's challenge. The storm raged on, consuming all. Chapter 8. The Wrath of the Reaver. The Skraeling's wrath groaned like a dying beast as the Tide Reaver struck again. Its blood-stained talons carved through the hull, sending splinters and crew alike crashing into the frothing sea. The air was filled with screams and the clash of weapons, as the remaining warriors of the ship fought desperately against the massive beast. Vargan Blood-Eye stood at the center of the chaos, his axe gripped tightly in his bloodied hands. His armor was dented and torn, his face streaked with the blood of both allies and enemies. The deck beneath him was slick with gore, but his one good eye burned with unyielding fury. "Stand your ground," he roared, his voice rising above the cacophony. "Khorne watches us. Fight or die forgotten." His words spurred the crew into action, but their efforts were futile. The Tide Reaver was an avatar of destruction, a monstrous force of nature that dwarfed their mortal strength. Its crimson eyes gleamed with malice as it tore through the ship, its massive body smashing through masts and ripping apart the deck with horrifying ease. The beast was cunning. It attacked from below, ramming the hull with its spiked body, and then rose above, striking with its claws and jagged teeth. The Skraeling's wrath was breaking apart piece by piece, and Vargan could feel the fight slipping away. Yet, even as the ship crumbled around him, Vargan refused to retreat. "This is my moment," he snarled, his voice thick with rage and desperation. "This is the test." The Tide Reaver lunged toward him, its jaws snapping shut mere feet from where he stood. Vargan leaped forward, swinging his axe in a wide arc that connected with the beast's hide. Sparks flew as the blade bit into its scales, but the wound was shallow, barely a scratch against its immense form. The beast roared in anger, swiping at him with a talon the size of a ballista. Vargan barely dodged in time, the force of the strike sending him sprawling across the blood-slicked deck. He rose to his feet, laughing wildly. "Is that all you have?" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Come on, beast. Give me a worthy death." But the Tide Reaver was far from done. It turned its fury on the rest of the ship, its tail smashing through the starboard side, sending men screaming into the churning waters. Vargan could see the fear in his crew's eyes, their spirits broken by the sheer power of the monster. "No!" he bellowed, striding toward the altar at the ship's heart. The makeshift shrine, built from bloodied iron and bone, pulsed faintly with chaotic energy. "You will not falter. Your blood will fuel our victory." The crew hesitated, their weapons trembling in their hands. Vargan raised his axe high, his voice a thunderous roar. "Khorne, hear me. Take their lives. take their blood. Give me the strength to slay this beast in your name." The altar glowed brighter, the runes upon it blazing with crimson light. The crew screamed as they were consumed, their bodies erupting into fountains of blood that surged toward Vargan. The crimson tide wrapped around him, seeping into his flesh, filling him with a strength that burned like molten iron. His muscles bulged, his veins pulsing with raw power. The whispering voices of the storm fell silent, replaced by the deafening roar of Khorne's approval. Vargan turned toward the Tide Reaver, his face twisted into a mask of fury and madness. "Now, beast," he growled, his voice resonating with the power of the blood god. "Let us finish this." The Tide Reaver roared in response, its crimson eyes narrowing as it charged toward him. Vargan met its attack head-on, his axe glowing with chaotic energy as he swung it with inhuman strength. The blade struck true, biting deep into the beast's flesh. For a moment it seemed as though he might succeed. The Tide Reaver recoiled, blood spilling from the wound, its roar of pain shaking the very sea. Vargan pressed the attack, his strikes relentless, each blow carving deeper into the monster's hide. But the Tide Reaver was no ordinary foe. It was a manifestation of chaos itself, a creature born of destruction and fury. As Vargan fought, the beast's wounds began to heal, its strength seemingly endless. It lashed out with a talon, catching him across the chest and sending him crashing into the shattered remnants of the ship's mast. Vargan coughed, blood spilling from his lips, but he pushed himself to his feet. He raised his axe once more, his body broken, but his spirit unyielding. "I am Vargan Blood-Eye," he roared, his voice echoing across the storm. "I will not fall." The Tide Reaver surged forward, its jaws opening wide. Vargan charged to meet it, his axe raised high for one final strike. The world seemed to slow, the storm fading into silence as the two collided. The last thing Vargan saw was the beast's glowing eyes, filled with a terrible, mocking intelligence. Then, darkness consumed him. The Skraeling's wrath was gone, its crew annihilated, its captain lost to the depths. The Tide Reaver vanished into the storm, leaving nothing but wreckage and blood-streaked waves in its wake. Above, the skies cleared, revealing a blood-red moon that hung heavy in the heavens. Khorne's laughter echoed faintly across the sea, a sound of triumph and cruel amusement. Chapter 9. The Price of Hubris. Vargan Blood-Eye emerged from the wreckage of the Skraeling's wrath, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body battered but still defiant. The once mighty vessel was reduced to a graveyard of splintered timbers and twisted iron, its remnants scattered across the blood-streaked waves. The crew was gone, sacrificed, slain, or dragged into the depths. All that remained was Vargan and the Tide Reaver. The beast rose from the sea like a god of destruction, its colossal form silhouetted against the crimson light of the storm. Its jagged spines glistened with seawater and gore, and its eyes, burning with malevolent intelligence, fixed on Vargan with something almost resembling contempt. Vargan stood atop a precarious section of the wreckage, the altar of Khorne's blessing still faintly glowing beneath his boots. His axe, impossibly heavy with the weight of chaos, felt like an extension of his will, its edge gleaming with the blood of his sacrifices. "This ends now," he growled, his voice low and guttural. He tightened his grip on the haft of his weapon, his muscles straining against the raw power coursing through him. "Come, beast, face me, and let the blood god judge us both." The Tide Reaver roared, the sound a mixture of primal fury and dark laughter. The sea churned around it, waves crashing against the shattered remains of the ship. With terrifying speed, it lunged forward, its massive talons raking through the wreckage as it closed the distance between them. Vargan didn't flinch. He leaped toward the beast, his axe swinging in a deadly arc. The blade connected with the Tide Reaver's shoulder, cutting deep into its crimson flesh. Black ichor spilled from the wound, sizzling as it hit the sea. The beast recoiled, letting out a deafening roar of pain and fury. Vargan landed heavily, his boots slamming into the broken planks beneath him. "Oh, is that all you've got?" he snarled, his voice laced with defiance. The Tide Reaver surged forward again, its jaws snapping shut mere inches from Vargan's face. He dodged to the side, his axe coming down on the creature's forelimb. The blade bit deep, severing tendons and sending another gush of ichor spilling into the water. For a moment, it seemed as though he had the upper hand. The beast stumbled, its movements slower, more deliberate. Vargan grinned, his eye alight with triumph. His snitchwatch. The Tide Reaver was not so easily defeated. It lashed out with its tail, the spiked appendage catching Vargan across the chest and sending him hurtling into the wreckage. He slammed into the altar, the force of the blow knocking the wind from his lungs. Pain lanced through his body, but he forced himself to rise. His armor was cracked, blood seeping from a dozen wounds, but still he stood. "I am not finished," he roared, raising his axe once more. The Tide Reaver turned to face him, its wounds already beginning to heal. It moved with a terrifying grace, its massive form dwarfing Vargan as it advanced. The storm seemed to quiet, the winds falling still as the two combatants faced each other. Vargan charged, his axe glowing with Khorne's fury as he swung it with all his might. The blade found its mark, burying itself deep in the Tide Reaver's chest. The beast let out a roar of agony, its massive claws flailing as it struggled to dislodge the weapon. For a brief, fleeting moment, Vargan felt the thrill of victory. He had struck a mortal blow, a wound that even the Tide Reaver could not ignore. But the beast was not done. With a final desperate lunge, it struck him with its claw, the blow ripping through his armor and tearing into his flesh. Vargan staggered, blood pouring from his wounds, his strength fading. The Tide Reaver reared back, its jaws opening wide. Vargan, his vision blurring, raised his axe one last time. "Khorne," he roared, his voice carrying across the storm. The beast struck, its massive jaws closing around him. Pain exploded through his body, and the world went dark. In his final moments, Vargan saw a vision. It was not the glory he had imagined, not the halls of Khorne where he would be celebrated as a champion. Instead, he saw the blood god himself, seated upon his brass throne, his face a mask of cruel amusement. Khorne laughed, a sound that shook Vargan to his core. The realization hit him like a blade to the gut. He had never been destined to triumph. He had been a pawn, a source of blood and slaughter to fuel the eternal war. As the vision faded, Vargan felt a strange sense of peace. His life had been one of bloodshed and rage, and it had ended as it was always meant to, in the service of Khorne. The Tide Reaver disappeared into the depths, its wounds slowly healing as it left the wreckage behind. The storm began to dissipate, the skies clearing to reveal a blood-red moon hanging heavy above the sea. The Skraeling's wrath was gone, its captain and crew lost to the endless tides. But the waters still bore the stain of their blood, a fitting tribute to the god who cared only for slaughter. Chapter 10. Blood and Waves. The ocean was eerily calm now, the storm's fury spent. The once proud Skraeling's wrath was no more. its shattered remains scattered across the blood-streaked waves. Jagged timbers and twisted iron floated alongside the corpses of the crew, their lifeless forms drifting aimlessly in the crimson tide. Vargan Blood-Eye lay sprawled upon a fragment of the ship's deck, his body broken, his lifeblood seeping into the water. He felt the salt sting of the sea in his wounds, but his mind was far from the pain. His vision wavered between the present and the visions of his final moments, the mocking laughter of Khorne, the realization of his fate as a pawn in the endless cycle of slaughter. The Tide Reaver loomed in the distance, its massive form receding into the depths. The beast moved with a languid grace, its bloodied scales gleaming in the faint light of the blood-red moon. Vargan's one good eye locked onto it, his chest heaving with the effort of his final breaths. "More finished," he rasped, his voice a ghost of its former power. His hand reached for his axe, but it was gone, lost to the sea along with his strength. The Tide Reaver paused for a moment, its massive head turning as if to acknowledge him. Its crimson eyes burned with the same cruel intelligence, the same dark mockery that had haunted Vargan throughout the hunt. And then it was gone, disappearing beneath the waves with barely a ripple. Vargan's vision blurred, the world tilting as the cold embrace of death claimed him. His last thought was not of triumph or glory, but of the futility of it all. The hunt, the sacrifices, the blood spilled in Khorne's name. It had meant nothing. Ulva the Withered dragged herself onto a floating shard of the ship's mast, her frail body trembling with exhaustion. Her iron veil was cracked, revealing a gaunt, hollow face etched with despair. She clutched her staff, its runes flickering weakly, and stared into the distance where the Tide Reaver had vanished. The waters around her were silent, save for the faint lap of waves against the wreckage. The few survivors of the battle were scattered, their minds broken by what they had witnessed. One man gibbered incoherently, his hands clawing at the air. Another sat motionless, his vacant stare fixed on nothing. Ulva's gaze remained on the horizon, where the blood-red moon cast its haunting light upon the sea. She could still feel the Tide Reaver's presence, a lingering weight that pressed against her mind. It was no ordinary beast, no mere monster of the deep. "It is an avatar," she whispered, her voice hoarse and trembling. "A vessel of Khorne's endless hunger. It cannot be killed because it is not meant to die. It is destruction incarnate." Her words carried no solace, only a chilling certainty. The Tide Reaver had been a test, a manifestation of Khorne's will, sent not to be defeated, but to perpetuate the endless cycle of bloodshed and slaughter. The beast would rise again, and others would come, fools and zealots, drawn by visions of glory and blinded by their own hubris. The cycle would continue. Ulva lowered her head, her strength failing. The bloodied sea stretched out around her, a vast and uncaring expanse. The Tide Reaver was gone, but its shadow remained, etched into her soul like a scar. Above, the blood-red moon loomed, a silent witness to the carnage below. Khorne's laughter echoed faintly on the wind,